Actually, I don't want to do that. I want to talk about this first. Let's talk about the Passover, because we're in the season of Passover. And the thing I want us to think about is one of the ethics that comes out of Passover, one of the ethical things that comes out. Go with me to Exodus chapter 22. Anytime you find a phrase repeated over and over again, it's something that we should take seriously and should focus on. Exodus chapter 22. You can write these down. Exodus chapter 22, verse 21. Exodus 22:21 says this: "You shall neither mistreat a stranger nor oppress him, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt." Okay? So there is an ethic that comes out of our deliverance from Egypt. We are now supposed to think in terms of how we treat other people, understanding how we were treated in Egypt. By the way, this is why it's so important for us to understand that we came out of Egypt too. We will disconnect from this text if we don't understand that we came out of Egypt that night as well. So he says, and by the way, this is another translation issue. Those of you that are, and I appreciate Joseph Telushkin, who's an Orthodox Jew. If you read the JPS, Jewish Publication Society, they did a bait and switch on this particular verse. It was really cool. That's what they said. This is JPS. They said, "You shall neither mistreat a stranger, you should not neither mistreat a convert, for you were foreigners in the land of Egypt." They wanted to translate the word ger as a convert, but they realized we got a problem. That means we were converts, we were proselytes in Egypt. So they translate the same, JPS translates the same Hebrew word two different ways in the same verse.
Meaning we're converted in Egypt.
Yes, they were converted in Egypt, just not to Egyptian proselytism. So, my point is this: the ethic that comes out of Exodus is this: because you were in Egypt, now this is how you have to treat other people the way you would have wanted to be treated. Would you want to have been treated this way? Okay. Now, go with me to Exodus chapter 23, verse 9. Chapter 23 of Exodus and verse 9. We'll run through these. It says this: "And you shall not oppress a stranger." Okay, ger. "For you know the heart of a stranger, because you were strangers in the land of Egypt." You know what it was like. Don't do it. Well, look at me at Leviticus. Leviticus chapter 19. Leviticus chapter 19. Why is this text important? Somebody will tell me why Leviticus 19 is important. I mean, there's multiple reasons. Huh? About holiness, that's one. Definitely about holiness. What else about Leviticus 19?
Kind of retelling and detailing some of the 10, but intermixing them with commandments that most people don't consider part of the 10 and wouldn't think should be connected.
Correct. Very well said. It's the 10 Commandments. It's got the 10 Commandments all over it, interspersed with other commandments. Okay, so the 10 Commandments are in Leviticus 19, but they're interspersed with other things that you might not think were connected. Why else is Leviticus 19 important? Thank you. There we go. Leviticus 19:18. "And you shall love your neighbor as yourself." Leviticus 19:18. Which is connected both grammatically, via hafta, and you shall love, with Deuteronomy 6:5, via hafta, and you shall love the Lord your God. So both those, and you shall love. So, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Leviticus 19:18.
And on these two
commandments hang all the Torah and the prophets. Okay? Why else is Leviticus 19 important? Anybody know what book of the Bible is built off of it?
Keep my Sabbaths. Keep my Sabbaths.
Yeah, keep my Sabbath, definitely.
James.
Letter of Yaakov.
Yaakov, thank you, Yaakov.
Jacob.
Jacob, let's go back to Jacob. The book of Jacob is built off of Leviticus 19. He quotes from it numerous times and alludes to it numerous times. Is it any wonder that Luther did not like Jacob? He called it a right straw epistle because it was built off Leviticus 19. He knew that it was thoroughly immersed in Torah, and he went, I don't like it. I don't like it.
Well, he was even addressed to the Hebrews in the Spurgeon.
Martin
Yes.
Luther.
Martin Luther says he called the book of Yaakov, what we call James. He said James is a right straw epistle. In other words, straw. It's fodder for the animals that you would put down on the floor.
Straw man.
It's a straw. Yes, it's worthless because he knew that Leviticus 19 was the core of Yaakov. So he went, uh-oh, we got a problem.
Well, when you want to make strife, you pit one brother against the other. And Yaakov was pitted against Paul's writings.
Yes.
And it's to this day.
Yep. To this day, yes.
If I remember correctly, he claimed that what he was claiming was that it was people that came sometime after James and named James and slept some stuff together.
Yeah, there's that theory too. Yeah, you're right. That's the theory. Yes, absolutely. All right, look at Leviticus 19:33. Leviticus 19:33 says this, and if a stranger dwells with you in your land, you shall not mistreat him. The stranger who dwells among you shall be to you as one born among you. And you shall love him as yourself, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Which the phrase, I am the Lord your God, is I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. That's the full phrase. It's just a truncated way of saying the same thing. Look at Deuteronomy chapter 5. We'll go to Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy chapter 5 and look at verse 12. Deuteronomy chapter 5 verse 12 says this. Now look at how this gets all wrapped into it. Observe the Sabbath day. So Deuteronomy 5 is about the Ten Commandments. And by the way, remember what we said earlier, that Leviticus 19 is about the 10. And you have the Ahavta, and you shall love. And notice that the next time we have the Ahavta is with Deuteronomy 6:5. And what does that come on the heels of? The Ten Commandments. So grammatically and textually, everything's swirling around these commandments. Now look what he says. He says this, observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy, as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work, neither you nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your ox, nor your donkey, nor any of your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates, that your male servant and your female servant may rest as well as you. And remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there by a mighty hand and by an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. Now notice what happens here. I've heard my evangelical brothers say, well, the Sabbath is a ceremonial law. No, that doesn't work. Here's why. You have an ethical decision to make on the Sabbath if you're a landowner. You have to decide whether you're going to let all your cattle rest and whether you're going to let everybody else rest who works for you. Anytime you have an ethical decision to make, it's moral. It's ethical. It's not enough to just say, well, it's civil. It doesn't work. I know they try to bifurcate. Actually, they try to civil, ceremonial, and ethical, moral. Doesn't work.
That's a
man-made division. The text doesn't try to do that. Look what we said with Leviticus 19:18. Leviticus 19. All these commandments are interspersed. Now, notice this. He says, with a mighty hand and by an outstretched arm. That's Exodus language. Anybody that's read Exodus knows. With an outstretched hand, my mighty hand and an outstretched arm. We've shown you in the past how that language comes out of Egyptian literature. That's God kind of saying, I know what Pharaoh says. Pharaoh says that he has a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, but actually I do. It's kind of God mocking Pharaoh and saying, the one who really has a mighty hand and an outstretched arm is me. And oh, by the way, one of these things that we should do sometime is we should look at all the language in the text. We're going to do this at one point. All the language in the text where God has body parts. God has body parts. Now, I know what we're going to say, well, that's metaphorical, and I agree with you. However, it starts to make me think there's a chance that God might have a body. I'm going to use a lot of body parts to describe him, and then I'm going to claim that he's immaterial. All right. We'll come back to that later. We're going to come back to that because, almost every body part you can think of just about is used to describe God. He's got hands, he's got feet, he's got fingers, he's got a head, he's got ears, he's got eyes. Well, that pretty much sounds like incarnation to me. Pretty soon you have to kind of go, if God is so immaterial, it can never take on humanity, then why are we going to keep using, we would want to stay away from body parts in the metaphor to describe him.
Made in our image.
Yeah. So go with me to, so in speaking of the Sabbath, just for a moment, segue to Isaiah 52. Excuse me, Isaiah 56. Isaiah 56, look what he says. Speaking of foreigners and the Sabbath. Isaiah 56:6. This is huge. Also the sons of the foreigner, this is the word nothri, absolute foreigner, who join themselves to the Lord to serve him and to love the name of the Lord, where the name of the Lord is being used to speak of him and his person, who he is. To be his servants, everyone who keeps from defiling the Sabbath and holds fast my covenant, even them I will bring to my holy mountain and make them joyful in my house of prayer. Beit Tefillah. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices will be accepted on my altar, for my house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations. It was God's intent to draw the nations in all along, to use the nation of Israel as the drawing point, the physical on-earth drawing point for all the people groups. Okay, that was always his intent. Continuing on, go with me to Deuteronomy chapter 10. Deuteronomy chapter 10. And look at verse 19. Look what he says. Deuteronomy chapter 10, verse 19. Therefore, love the stranger, foreigner, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Okay? You've got to love them. What is that, by the way? Okay. What does it mean to love?
Be loyal.
Be loyal. Okay.
Treat them with respect.
Treat them with respect.
Treat them better than yourself.
Treat them better than yourself. What does it mean to love?
Be willing to die for them.
You willing to die for them?
Compassion.
Compassion. Okay.
Care for their needs.
Care. There we go. That's the end of it. Care for their needs. You can't love somebody unless you care for their needs. Loving, listen to what I'm going to say to you. This is huge. Love has nothing to do with how you feel or an emotion in the biblical text.
Amen.
Emotions will follow. They're important. They have their place. But God isn't commanding us to have warm, fuzzy feelings for people. He's commanding us to do things for people. The feelings will follow.
Help them through when others think they're through.
Exactly. Exactly.
Awesome.
In fact, I'm supposed to do things, I'm supposed to show love, demonstrate love, service to people who I don't really like.
That's right.
And in fact, when you find yourself not wanting to do something good for somebody, that's really the Spirit of God telling you to do something for that person.
It's easy to do something for somebody.
Yeah, Yeshua says as much. Look, the pagan people do nice things for people that do things for them. Simple pagans who don't serve God at all, they love their friends. They'll loan them $5. They'll help them out with your, because you scratch my back and I'll scratch your back. Okay, fine, it's reciprocal. But Yeshua says, you know what? You've got to love the guy who doesn't love you. Right? I got to love a guy who I know doesn't like me.
Go sit down.
If I find the ox of a guy who's my enemy in my stuff, he's in my field, his ox is in my field, I got to return his ox to him. But I don't like him because he doesn't like me. I've heard he doesn't like me. He's told me he doesn't like me. And he's told other people he doesn't like me. Now my feeling isn't to love him, but I still have to do the right by him when I don't feel like it. So the command to love has nothing to do with feelings or emotions. It has to do with doing what's right because it's right. The emotions will connect later on. The emotions will come along and will eventually catch up. And even if they don't, even if you don't feel like doing right, do it anyway.
Well, that's basically the example that God wants, or that God has done for us, that do unto others. I mean, He loved us, we didn't love Him.
Absolutely.
And when we were His enemies, and He still came through for us. So how much more should we come through for people who we don't like?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Look, what does Yeshua say? He says, if you come to the altar and you know that your enemy, you don't have anything against him. You have nothing against him. But you know that your enemy has something against you. He says, leave your sacrifice and go be reconciled to your brother. You go find him and say, look, we got to try to get this right. You're not going to feel like doing that, but that's the right thing to do. Go with me to Deuteronomy chapter 15. Look at verse 15. He says this is speaking of the release of the debt slavery. It's debt slavery. That's key. Look at this. He says, verse 12. Go back to verse 12. He says, if your brother, a Hebrew man or a Hebrew woman, is sold to you and serves you 6 years, then in the 7th year you shall let him go free from you. And when you send him away free from you, you shall not let him go away empty-handed. You shall supply him liberally from your flock, from your threshing floor, from your winepress, from what the Lord has blessed you with. You shall give to him. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and that the Lord your God redeemed you. Therefore I command you this thing today. Don't forget how you guys came out. Okay? So the Exodus becomes the ethic for how we treat other people. This is huge. He keeps repeating this. So it tells us that it's massively important. This is how you're supposed to. By the way, Israel got themselves in trouble. We find in the prophets they stopped releasing their debt slaves. They kept them way beyond the time that they were supposed to release them. Not good. All right, go with me to Deuteronomy chapter 16. One chapter over. Deuteronomy chapter 16, verse 12. Actually, let's go back to verse 9. We'll read down. He says this. This goes to our time today. Very relevant. He says this. You shall count 7 weeks for yourself, begin to count the 7 weeks from the time you begin to put the sickle to the grain. Then you shall keep the feast of weeks, Shabbat, to the Lord your God, with the tribute of a freewill offering from your hand, which you shall give as the Lord your God blesses you. You shall rejoice before the Lord your God, you and your son and your daughter, your male servant and your female servant, the Levite who is within your gates, the stranger and the fatherless and the widow who are among you, at the place where the Lord your God chooses to make his name abide, the tabernacle, Jerusalem. And you shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and you shall be careful to observe these statutes.
Careful.
So, it's huge. One last text. Go with me to Deuteronomy chapter 24. Deuteronomy chapter 24. Look at verse 17. Verse 17. You shall not pervert justice, due the stranger or the fatherless, nor take a widow's garment as a pledge, but you shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you from there. Therefore, I command you to do this thing. He keeps saying it over and over again. Over and over again. So many of the commandments are because you were a slave in Egypt. You know what it was like. Don't treat anybody like this. Don't oppress anybody. Don't allow injustice to happen. Make sure you take care of those who need to be taken care of. Because you know what it was like to be in Egypt. This, like I said earlier, is extremely important for us to understand that we were in Egypt with them. We were in Egypt with them. We came out with them. If we don't understand that, we will not understand the force behind this ethic that says, you were in Egypt with them. You must treat people this particular way because I brought you out of Egypt. You have to remember what it was like. You can never forget. That's why we were to keep doing this perpetually, to keep remembering. So that when it came to these commandments, we would understand, when we read these texts that we read numerous ones, because you were a slave in Egypt. Because you were a slave in Egypt. Never forget the pit from which you were dug. Do not forget where he, and by the way, let's talk about this really quick. This whole cycle of redemption. He redeems us in Egypt. There's absolutely no way any of us could have redeemed ourselves. We had such a slave mentality, we didn't even know where to begin to redeem ourselves. And in fact, the first generation that came out had such a slave mentality that all of them died in the wilderness, with the exception of 2. Because, and this is our problem as well, oftentimes we come out of Egypt, but Egypt doesn't come out of us. We still live with a slave mentality. We still, all of us, are living with slave mentality. There's not a one of us that doesn't still have residual baggage. I call it junk in the trunk. From all the things we've learned and studied and thought to be true over the years, and then we have to realize, you know what? That didn't have much foundation in fact or truth. And we have to jettison that. And we're still jettisoning things. So he brings us out. But the cycle of redemption is not complete. Look at the whole cycle. The cycle is this. He brings us out of Egypt. That's our redemption. Then he says, count 7 sevens. That's perfection. Count 7 sevens, and I'll bring you to Mount Sinai, where I'll give you more commandments. Not the first time I've given you commandments. I'm going to give you some more commandments. So you'll know my will. You won't have to ask yourselves, what does God want from us? It doesn't make you redeemed. You're already redeemed. You're already redeemed. He's not giving us commandments to redeem us. He gives us commandments to sanctify us. Then he says, oh, by the way, now here's what I want to do. By the way, now what's going to happen? Yeshua's going to die on Passover. Outpouring of the Spirit at Shabbat, Pentecost. And oh, by the way, in the Torah, the Holy Spirit also writes the Torah. Finger of God, Exodus 31:8. Then what happens? We move to the fall. Yom Teruah, the day of the blowing. The kingship of God. God is coronated as king. Day of Atonement. Why is the Day of Atonement important? Eschatologically. Not the Day of Atonement in Leviticus, but the Day of Atonement eschatologically. Anybody want to guess?
When Christ started his ministry?
Could say that. That's possible. That's a possibility. Yeah.
Couldn't enter the temple with sin.
Couldn't enter the temple. You can't enter the temple with sin. Absolutely, and I'm on board with that. But there's something that connects it up with the trumpets. Connect it up with the trumpets.
Well, the
Because
final.
Paul says, 1 Thessalonians, 1 Corinthians, the last trumpet. There's something interesting. There's a time that a trumpet's blown on Yom Kippur. Yovel. Jubilee. Yovel and Jubilee are put together. It's the same. We get the word Jubilee from the word Yovel. And the word Yovel means ram's horn. Another word for ram's horn, the shofar, is Yovel. So we have the trumpet blown at Yom Teruah, the day of the blowing, modern day is Rosh Hashanah, and you also have the release. In other words, at Yom Kippur, every 50th year, there's a release of the land back to its original owner. Everything goes back, so to speak, to where it belongs. And then what happens? 5 days later, we have, so we have 10, then 5, then Sukkot, and then we have Sukkot for 7 days.
We have to be prepared for him to be Emmanuel.
Yeah, it's a preparation.
Yeah.
So eschatologically, these festivals are saying, hey look, the king is coming. He has come and he will come again. And then what happens? Sukkot is where we tabernacle with him forever. We live with him forever. And oh, by the way, Sukkot kind of takes us back to somewhat of the beginning, because Sukkot is the time in which he was physically born. So it all kind of comes full circle. And what does Sukkot commemorate as well? Why do we live in these booths for 8 days? Because he brought us out of Egypt.
Remember.
And when we remember that we came out of Egypt. And when we came out, we lived in these booths for a year until we could build more permanent dwellings. So he says, you know what? I want you to, every year, I want you to do Passover. I want you to remember that you were slaves in Egypt, that I brought you out. And by the way, when we get to the very end and we live forever with him, he says, I want you to remember that I brought you out for a purpose. I brought you out for my kingship. It was always about the sovereignty and the kingship of God. That was the whole purpose. This has always been, I keep saying this has always been about him. It's never been about us. It's always been about his dominion, his rule, his reign on this earth. Everything he is doing, the big picture, is the rule and reign of God on this earth. And you and I get to participate in that if we submit to the king. And submission to the king comes when the king tells us what he wants us to do. We do it, not because it makes us something, but because we are something. The rules of the kingdom are not designed to make us something. They're designed because we are something. Birds don't fly to become birds. Fish don't swim to become fish. They swim and they fly because of what they are. We don't keep commandments in order to become something. We keep commandments because we are something. If we are redeemed, this is the goal of the redeemed, to please our God and to be in submission to his sovereignty. And if he commands something, then we try to do it because it's what he has commanded. Yes?
I was just going to say that a lot of the baggage, as you call it, junk and trunk, different traditions on both sides of the aisle, you know. So much of it is man trying to make God in his image versus we're in God's image.
Right.
And a lot of times, you know, I can take it to the Trinity, you know. They divide God up because our little brains can't gather all of it in a complex unity with our Greek mindset, you know. And so we try to make God in our image so we can understand it. And then a lot of times those little doctrines, you know, help people understand, superseded the word.
Right. Yeah, go with me to Exodus chapter 23. Go ahead, Karen.
Oh, I was just thinking that probably to piggyback on what was saying that people were trying to sell God to people and make him palatable so that people would come to church, so that people would, you know, and because they're thinking about, oh, it's for me, he'll save me, he'll do this for me, and that,
Right.
you know, and that's the difference right there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I want to show you a text that, look at Exodus chapter 23. We'll end with this. This is speaking, by the way, this is Yeshua. This is Jesus before he was Jesus. This is Yeshua before we ever knew him on the pages of the apostolic text. Look at Exodus chapter 23 and verse 20. It says, behold,